The phone on my nightstand wouldn't stop buzzing. 103 missed calls. It was Monday morning at exactly 8 a.m., and my former boss, a smug 32-year-old heir named Bradley Caldwell, was entering a state of absolute, unadulterated panic. Over $450 million in critical import cargo was frozen solid at the ports of Los Angeles, Savannah, and Newark. Cargo ships were idling, customs officers were refusing clearance, and the company was bleeding money by the second. Bradley had fired me less than 48 hours ago with a smug grin, believing I was just an outdated replaceable gear in his corporate machine. What he didn't know, and what he was about to find out the hard way, was that I held the keys to the entire operation. To understand how we got to this point of total system failure, you have to understand how Caldwell Logistics Group actually works, and how I spent 15 years of my life building the very system that Bradley was currently trying to tear down. My name is Julian Vance. I am 48 years old, and up until last Friday, I was the Senior Director of Global Routing Systems for Caldwell Logistics. I spent my early career studying maritime law and supply chain logistics, earning my federal customs broker license in my late 20s. In 2011, when I was 33, I was hired by Richard Caldwell, Bradley's father. Richard was a self-made logistics mogul who built the company from a small regional trucking outfit into a mid-sized international freight forwarder. When I joined, the company was doing about $40 million in revenue, but Richard had massive ambitions. He wanted to handle global imports, managing everything from ocean freight container unloading to long-haul truck routing across the United States. The biggest challenge in global logistics isn't moving the trucks or loading the ships. It's dealing with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. Under Title 19 of the United States Code, every single commercial shipment entering the country must be cleared through customs. To do this, a company must post a customs bond. A customs bond is essentially a financial guarantee to the federal government that all duties, taxes, and fees will be paid, and that all import regulations will be strictly followed. Without a valid customs bond, your cargo sits on the dock, and after 72 hours, the port authorities start charging massive storage fees known as demurrage. If you still don't clear the cargo, the government can seize the goods. Back in 2011, Caldwell Logistics was growing too fast for its own good. We had just secured a massive contract to import electronics and retail goods for several major U.S. department stores. But the company hit a sudden credit crunch. An acquisition had gone bad, cash flow was tight, and the corporate credit rating plummeted. When we went to secure the necessary continuous customs transit bond from the federal surety underwriters, we were flatly rejected. Without a $500,000 continuous bond, we couldn't clear the upcoming shipments. The retail clients were threatening to sue for millions if their goods were delayed at the docks. Richard Caldwell was beside himself with stress. He sat in my office, rubbing his temples, whispering about bankruptcy. That was when I offered him a solution. A few years prior, I had incorporated a small personal entity, Vance Logistic Consulting LLC, to handle independent brokerage work. Through my LLC, I held a clean, active federal customs broker license and possessed an excellent personal credit rating. I went to the underwriters and secured a continuous customs transit bond under Vance Logistics Consulting LLC, specifically registered as bond number VLC 99824US. I proposed a deal to Richard. I would lease my LLC's customs transit bond and our custom-built routing clearance system to Caldwell Logistics Group. The terms of the lease were simple. Caldwell Logistics would pay my LLC a nominal fee of $1 per year. In exchange, they could use my personal bond and licensing to clear all their international imports. However, there was a critical clause in that agreement, written by my attorney and signed by Richard himself. The lease of the customs bond was tied directly to my personal employment. If Julian Vance was ever terminated by Caldwell Logistics for any reason other than documented criminal misconduct, the lease agreement for bond number VLC 99824US would terminate automatically with 24 hours notice, and all routing authority would revert back to Vance Logistics Consulting LLC. Richard didn't care about the fine print back then. He was desperate. He signed the agreement, patted my back, and told me I had saved the company. For the next 15 years, that lease agreement sat in a dusty corporate binder in the legal archives. I worked 80 hours a week, building our routing infrastructure from the ground up. I integrated our proprietary tracking software directly with the CBP automated broker interface. Year after year, Caldwell Logistics grew. By 2026, the company's annual recurring revenue reached $850 million. We were clearing thousands of containers a week, keeping the shelves of major retail chains stocked across North America. But then, things changed. Richard Caldwell's health began to fail, and he took a step back from day-to-day operations. In 2021, his son Bradley joined the firm as the vice president of fleet management. Bradley was 27 at the time, armed with an expensive business degree from an Ivy League school, a massive chip on his shoulder, and absolutely zero real-world experience in logistics. He spent his first few years walking around the office in designer suits, criticizing the way the veteran staff operated, and complaining that we were paying our senior employees too much. In early 2026, Richard officially promoted Bradley to Chief Operating Officer. The moment Bradley took the reins, he set out to prove he was a corporate genius. He wanted to cut operating expenses by 15% across the board, to impress the company's private equity board members and secure a massive multi-million-dollar bonus for himself. He didn't understand the intricate, fragile web of relationships, licenses, and legal frameworks that kept the cargo moving. He only saw dollar signs, spreadsheets, and people he considered overpaid relics of his father's era. And unfortunately for him, I was at the very top of his list. By the summer of 2026, Bradley's cost-cutting campaign had turned the office into a pressure cooker. He had laid off half of the customer service representatives, reduced the maintenance budgets for our regional trucking hubs, and initiated an aggressive audit of all senior staff salaries. I watched all of this with growing frustration. Logistics is a game of margins, but it is also a game of reliability. If you cut corners on safety and compliance, the federal government will shut you down. If you underpay your routing managers, they leave, and your delivery schedules fall apart. I had warned Bradley several times in executive meetings, but he dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, calling me risk-averse and stuck in the past. To make matters worse, Bradley introduced a new policy that he proudly named the 24/7 Instant Operational Readiness Directive. It was a fancy way of saying that every salaried manager had to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including weekends. If a truck was delayed in Ohio at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, the logistics director was expected to answer the phone within 3 rings and resolve it. Bradley announced this in a company-wide email, stating that anyone who failed to respond immediately would be written up for insubordination. He claimed this was the only way to compete with larger global shipping companies. I didn't pay much attention to his posturing. I had worked for this company for 15 years, and my track record spoke for itself. I had kept our compliance rate at a perfect 99.8%, but Bradley was looking for an excuse to get rid of my $210,000 salary. He figured he could replace me with a 25-year-old business analyst who would work for $60,000 using the routing software templates I had already built. He just needed a catalyst. That catalyst came on the second Saturday of June. It was the day of my daughter's college graduation from Columbia University. It was a milestone I had promised myself I would not miss. 15 years of working late nights meant I had missed far too many track meets, piano recitals, and family dinners. I flew my wife and daughter to New York, checked into a hotel, and put my work phone on silent when the commencement ceremony began. For the first time in years, I was completely present for my family. While sitting in the auditorium watching my daughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma, my phone was vibrating in my pocket. Bradley was calling. A minor routing mapping glitch had occurred in our Chicago distribution hub. A local server had dropped connection, causing 42 trucks to queue outside the warehouse gates for about 20 minutes. It was a routine issue that any of my mid-level systems administrators could have resolved in their sleep. In fact, my lead systems admin did resolve it within 15 minutes of the alert. But Bradley, seeing the system alert on his dashboard, decided to call me directly to demand a full post-mortem report. He called me 4 times in the span of 30 minutes. When I didn't answer, he sent a series of increasingly frantic and aggressive emails, copying the entire executive board, including his father. His emails accused me of neglecting my duties, violating the 24/7 readiness policy, and putting the company's retail contracts at risk. By the time the graduation ceremony ended and we went out to lunch, I took out my phone and saw the missed calls and emails. I immediately called Bradley back. When he answered, he didn't even let me speak. He began screaming into the receiver, his voice cracking with rage. He accused me of being lazy, of taking my high salary for granted, and of showing zero respect for his leadership. I calmly explained that I was at my daughter's college graduation and that the Chicago issue had already been resolved by my team hours ago. He scoffed, telling me that family events were no excuse for ignoring the CEO of an $850 million company. He told me we would discuss my future on Monday morning. When I walked into the headquarters in Chicago at 8:00 a.m. on Monday, I was immediately summoned to the main conference room. I expected a private meeting, but Bradley had intentionally invited the entire operations team, the legal department, and several junior analysts. He wanted to make an example out of me. Bradley sat at the head of the long glass table, smirking, with a thick folder in front of him. As soon as I took a seat, he stood up and began his performance. He paced around the room, speaking in a loud, dramatic voice, pointing to slides on the projector screen that showed the 20-minute truck delay in Chicago. He accused me of gross insubordination, operational neglect, and willful disregard for corporate policy. He claimed that my lack of responsiveness was proof that I had checked out and was no longer fit to lead the routing division. "The industry is moving too fast for dinosaurs, Julian," Bradley said, looking around the room for approval from the junior analysts. "We need leaders who are fully committed to this firm, not people who hide behind their tenure and ignore urgent calls on the weekend. Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause. You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises." The room was dead silent. Several of my team members looked down at their desks, unable to look me in the eye. They knew it was a setup, but they were too afraid of Bradley to say anything. I looked at Bradley. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I simply took a deep breath, stood up, and looked him straight in the eyes. "Understood," I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the conference room. I walked back to my office, packed my family photos, my degree, and my personal notebook into a single cardboard box. Within 45 minutes of entering the building, I walked out of the lobby doors, leaving my building access card with the security guard. Bradley stood by the window on the second floor, looking down at me with a satisfied smirk on his face. He thought he had just saved the company $250,000 a year and established his absolute authority. He had no idea that he had just pulled the pin on a financial hand grenade. After leaving the headquarters, I didn't drive home. Instead, I pulled my sedan into the parking lot of a quiet local coffee shop about 3 blocks away. I found a corner table, ordered a black coffee, and opened my personal laptop. I sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the espresso machine and the chatter of the morning commuters. I felt a strange sense of calm. For 15 years, my life had been dictated by the constant stress of tracking shipments, managing port delays, and answering midnight emergency calls. Now I was free, but I was also determined to ensure that Bradley Caldwell paid the full price for his arrogance. I pulled up a secure cloud drive and opened a folder containing my personal legal documents. Inside was a scanned copy of the 2011 agreement between Vance Logistics Consulting LLC and Caldwell Logistics Group, signed in blue ink by Richard Caldwell. I scrolled down to Clause 8, the termination provision. The language was crystal clear, drafted by my longtime legal counsel, Teresa Cross, who specialized in federal trade and customs law. In the event that Julian Vance's employment with Caldwell Logistics Group is terminated for any reason other than documented criminal misconduct, the lease of Federal Customs Transit Bond VLC 99824 US and the associated Automated Broker Interface API license shall terminate automatically upon 24 hours written notice. Upon termination, all authority to clear cargo under said bond and software license shall revert solely to Vance Logistics Consulting LLC. I picked up my phone and dialed Teresa's direct line. She answered on the second ring. I quickly explained the situation. That Bradley had publicly fired me that morning for cause because I had missed a call during my daughter's graduation. Teresa let out a dry laugh. For cause? Missing a call on a weekend isn't cause for termination under Illinois employment law, let alone criminal misconduct. Bradley just handed us the perfect trigger, Julian. Have they sent the official severance paperwork or termination notice? Not yet, I replied, but I have the public firing recorded on my phone's voice memo app, and my corporate email access has already been revoked. They've already deactivated my badge. Good, Teresa said. That is constructive termination. Here is what we do. I will draft the official notice of lease termination for Bond VLC 99824 US. We will send it via email and certified mail to Caldwell Logistics General Counsel and to Richard's office. I will also submit the formal bond cancellation request directly to the CBP National Finance Center in Indianapolis. Under federal regulations, when a bond owner revokes authorization, the CBP is required to freeze the bond within 24 hours to prevent unauthorized imports. By tomorrow morning at 8, the company will have no legal bond to clear their incoming cargo. What about the custom-built routing API? I asked. Since the software code and CBP interface licensing are registered under your LLC and leased under the same contract, we will revoke the API access tokens tonight. By tomorrow morning, their entire automated customs routing system will go dark. They will be forced to manually file entry papers for every container, but without a bond, those entries will be immediately rejected. Anyway, let's proceed, I said. Send the notices. Teresa hung up to draft the paperwork. I sat back and took a sip of my coffee. I knew exactly what this meant. At any given moment, Caldwell Logistics had hundreds of shipping containers moving across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans bound for U.S. ports. Currently, we had 3 major container ships docked and unloading. One at the Port of Los Angeles with electronics, one at the Port of Newark with autumn retail apparel, and one at the Port of Savannah with industrial manufacturing parts. The combined value of the cargo on these ships was approximately $450 million. Normally, as these containers are unloaded, our automated routing system matches them with the continuous customs bond, VLC 99824 US, files the entry manifest with CBP, clears them within minutes, and routes them to our waiting fleet of 400 long-haul trucks. It was a seamless automated flow that I had spent a decade optimizing. But tomorrow morning, that flow would grind to a halt. When CBP's automated system tried to run the entry manifests against Bond VLC 99824 US, the system would return a critical error code, bond revoked by principal surety. The containers would be flagged with a federal customs hold. The port crane operators would be prohibited from loading the containers onto the trucks. By Tuesday afternoon, the demurrage charges would start accumulating. Under our port terminal agreements, the penalty for uncleared cargo was $150,000 per port per day. With 3 major ports blocked, Caldwell Logistics would face $450,000 a day in direct port penalties. But the real killer was the client contracts. Richard had secured contracts with 3 of the largest retail corporations in the country. These contracts contained strict, just-in-time delivery clauses. If we failed to deliver their autumn merchandise to their regional distribution centers within 72 hours of ship docking, the liquidated damages clauses kicked in. Caldwell Logistics would be fined $5 million per day for breach of contract. At 2 p.m. on Monday, Teresa emailed the formal lease termination notice to Caldwell Logistics. I knew Bradley's legal team would receive it, but I also knew how corporate legal departments worked. They would likely treat it as a routine administrative dispute and route it to a mid-level paralegal. Bradley himself was probably out celebrating his victory over the old guard. They had no idea that a massive digital wall was sliding into place, blocking their entire supply chain. I closed my laptop, went home, and spent the evening cooking dinner with my wife, sleeping better than I had in 15 years. On Tuesday morning, I woke up at my usual time of 6 a.m., but instead of rushing out the door, I made a fresh pot of coffee and sat on my porch. By 7:30 a.m., my personal phone began to vibrate. By 8 a.m., it was ringing continuously. I looked at the screen. The caller ID showed Bradley Caldwell and Caldwell Logistics HQ. I set my phone to silent, watched the birds, and finished my coffee. I knew exactly what was happening at the headquarters. At the Port of Newark, our regional transportation manager, Keith Vance, no relation to me, was standing in the customs terminal. He had 200 trucks lined up outside the gates, ready to load apparel containers for our largest retail client. But when the terminal gate operators tried to scan the container barcodes, the screen flashed red with a message from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Hold active. Invalid customs bond. Keith immediately called the Chicago Operations Center. Within minutes, similar reports flooded in from the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Savannah. Hundreds of truck drivers were idling on the asphalt, burning fuel, and blocking terminal traffic. The port authorities were furious, threatening to fine the company for creating traffic hazards. The shipping lines were demanding that we move our containers off the docks immediately, as new vessels were arriving. Back in Chicago, Bradley had arrived at the office, expecting to celebrate his first week as the undisputed leader of operations. Instead, he was met by a mob of panicked managers. The routing dashboards, which usually displayed thousands of green dots representing cleared and moving cargo, were flashing a bright, pulsing red. The automated clearance system was completely dead. The API keys had been revoked, and the software was refusing to connect to the federal databases. Bradley stormed into the IT department, screaming at the software developers to fix the system. But they told him the truth. We can't fix it, Bradley. The software license is owned by Vance Logistics Consulting LLC, and the API tokens have been invalidated. We don't have the source code or the security credentials to generate new ones. Julian Vance holds the master key. In a panic, Bradley ordered the legal department to secure a new continuous customs transit bond immediately. The company's general counsel called the federal surety underwriters. The response they received was a cold bucket of water. Because Caldwell Logistics Group had been using Julian's bond for 15 years, they didn't have an active corporate profile with the federal underwriters. To secure a new $500,000 continuous bond, the underwriters would have to perform a comprehensive financial audit of the firm, a process that would take at least 4 to 6 weeks. "We don't have 4 weeks!" Bradley screamed in his office, slamming his fist on the desk. "We have $450 million in cargo sitting on the docks right now. We are losing $500,000 a day in port penalties. And if those containers aren't at the retail distribution centers by Thursday, our clients will sue us for $5 million a day." By Tuesday afternoon, the founder of the company, Richard Caldwell, was alerted to the crisis. Despite his failing health, the 68-year-old patriarch drove himself to the headquarters. He marched into Bradley's office, threw a copy of the lease termination notice onto his son's desk, and demanded to know why Julian Vance had been fired. When Bradley tried to justify his decision by claiming I had missed a weekend call, Richard lost his temper. He realized that his son's arrogance had pushed the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Richard immediately grabbed his phone and called my personal number. I decided to answer Richard's call out of respect for our history. "Julian." Richard's voice was shaky, devoid of the strength he once had. "Julian, please. We have a massive crisis here. The ports are locked down. The retail clients are threatening to cancel their contracts. I built this company from nothing, Julian. Don't let my son's stupidity destroy it. What will it take to get the bond back online?" "Richard," I said calmly, "I respect you, and I appreciate the 15 years I spent helping you build this firm. But your son fired me in front of the entire operations team, claiming I was a dinosaur who was redundant. He accused me of operational neglect for attending my daughter's graduation. My employment is over. And as per our 2011 agreement, the lease on my personal customs bond is terminated. I have referred all negotiations to my trade attorney, Teresa Cross." Before Richard could respond, Bradley snatched the phone from his father's hand. "Listen to me, Julian," Bradley yelled into the phone, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and terror. "This is corporate sabotage. You are actively destroying this company. Our lawyers are drafting a lawsuit against you right now for tortious interference and breach of fiduciary duty. We will sue you for every dime you have, and we will take your LLC. I chuckled softly. Bradley, I suggest you consult your legal team before you make empty threats. Your father signed a valid contract in 2011. You terminated me without cause, which automatically triggered the lease termination. I am simply exercising my contractually protected property rights. If you want to talk, have your general counsel call Teresa Cross. Otherwise, enjoy the demurrage fees. I hung up the phone. 20 minutes later, Teresa called me to report that Caldwell Logistics' general counsel had contacted her, sounding desperate. They wanted to negotiate. Teresa told them that Julian Vance was open to a settlement, but it would not be cheap. The clock was ticking, and with every hour that passed, Caldwell Logistics was sliding closer to a $5 million a day penalty. By Wednesday morning, the pressure on Caldwell Logistics had reached a breaking point. The Port of LA terminal operators had already moved our container fleet to a storage yard, racking up over $200,000 in extra handling fees. More importantly, the vice president of supply chain at our largest retail client had called Richard Caldwell directly, stating that if their goods did not arrive at their regional distribution center in Dallas by Thursday morning, they would immediately terminate their multi-year contract and invoke the $5 million daily liquidated damages clause. The company was facing a catastrophic financial cliff. At 10 a.m. on Wednesday, a meeting was convened at Teresa Cross's law office in downtown Chicago. Richard Caldwell arrived accompanied by the company's general counsel. Bradley was notably absent. I sat on one side of the mahogany conference table with Teresa. Richard sat opposite us, looking tired and aged. The usual corporate swagger was entirely gone from his demeanor. Julian, Richard said, leaning forward. Let's skip the posturing. We don't have the time. Our legal counsel has reviewed the 2011 agreement. They confirm that the lease termination is valid and enforceable. We cannot bypass your bond without waiting 4 weeks, and 4 weeks will bankrupt the company. We need to buy Vance Logistics Consulting LLC, including the customs bond registration and the automated routing software licenses. What are your terms? Teresa slid a single-page document across the table. Our terms are non-negotiable, Richard. If you agree, the bond and API access will be restored within 30 minutes of the funds clearing. If you refuse, we walk, and you can explain to your board why the company is liquidated by Friday. Richard adjusted his reading glasses and looked at the page. The terms were simple but devastatingly precise. First, Caldwell Logistics Group would purchase Vance Logistics Consulting LLC, including all intellectual property, federal customs bond registration, VLC 99824 US, and associated software licenses, for a lump sum payment of $4,200,000, payable via immediate wire transfer. Second, Bradley Caldwell would be stripped of his title as Chief Operating Officer and terminated from all operational roles within Caldwell Logistics Group, effective immediately, for documented gross negligence. Third, the company would issue a formal, written statement to Julian Vance signed by Richard Caldwell, retracting the allegations of insubordination and acknowledging Julian's 15 years of exemplary service. Richard stared at the paper for a long time. The general counsel whispered in his ear, shaking his head, but Richard held up his hand to silence him. He knew they had no leverage. $4,200,000 was a massive sum, but it was less than 1 day of liquidated damages and port penalties. The loss of their primary retail client would destroy the company's valuation, making their $850 million revenue stream evaporate overnight. "Where is Bradley?" Richard asked quietly, looking up. "He's at home," the general counsel replied softly. "He has already been notified that his corporate credit cards and system access are suspended." Richard sighed, took a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket, and signed the settlement agreement. He slid it back to Teresa. "Send the routing codes to the wire transfer department. The funds will be in your account within 15 minutes. Teresa verified the bank routing details. I sat in silence as we waited. At exactly 10:24 a.m., Teresa's phone chimed with a confirmation from our escrow agent. $4,200,000 had been successfully deposited into the Vance Logistics Consulting LLC bank account. I opened my laptop, connected to the CBP automated broker interface, and updated the status of Bond VLC 99824 US, reauthorizing Caldwell Logistics Group as a licensed operator. I then generated a new set of API access tokens and sent them directly to the company's IT director. Within minutes, the red screens in the Chicago Operations Center began to clear. One by one, the routing dashboards turned green. At the ports of Los Angeles, Savannah, and Newark, U.S. customs holds were lifted. The waiting fleet of 400 trucks began loading containers, and the supply chain roared back to life. The retail cargo was delivered to the distribution centers on Wednesday night, just 6 hours before the contract deadline. A week later, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was the formal written apology from the board of Caldwell Logistics, signed by Richard. The letter praised my dedication and admitted that my termination was a severe administrative error. I also learned through my former colleagues that Bradley had been completely cut off from the family business. Richard had sent him to manage a small, unprofitable real estate holdings branch in Montana, far away from any operational decision-making. As for me, I used the $4,200,000 to secure my family's financial future. I set up college trust funds for my daughter and future grandchildren, and we bought a small house overlooking the ocean in Maine. I started a boutique logistics consulting firm, working only 10 hours a week, helping small import companies navigate federal customs regulations. Sometimes on Monday mornings, I sit on my deck with a hot cup of coffee and look at my silent phone. I smile, remembering the smug 32-year-old CO, who thought he could use his power to humiliate me. He tried to save a few pennies by treating a veteran employee like garbage, and in the end it cost him his career, his inheritance, and over $4 million. In the world of logistics, timing is everything, and I had timed my exit perfectly.